their invasion of Crimea. Crimea is effectively part of Russia. It's interesting, one of the first things the Russians did when they took over Crimea was they introduced the ruble as the currency. So if you go to Crimea today, you'll be getting rubles out of the banks and ATMs, and that's what you're spending. So a little facet of currency wars. But the United States is obviously not going to have a military response. No one in the U.S., really around the world, left, right, or center, thinks that the U.S. or NATO should have a military response to what's going on in Ukraine right now. But the U.S. didn't want to be seen to be doing nothing, so we immediately announced economic sanctions, which is a form of financial warfare. Now, what was interesting about that is these sanctions are practically meaningless. And I've been telling, some investors are nervous about this. I say, well, I think I can assure you that these sanctions are not going to go very far. In fact, to the extent that Russian stocks and the currency went down, if you're interested in investing in Russia, there's a good entry point there because that will reverse itself. Why are U.S. sanctions so tame? I mean, it literally amounts to a few bureaucrats and oligarchs not being able to go to the Super Bowl next year. Maybe their credit card doesn't work when they get off the plane in Geneva, but that's about the extent of it. The reason is that Russia has an enormous capacity to strike back, and they've already said that they will do so. In other words, what would serious sanctions look like? Well, the two biggest banks in Russia are Sberbank and Vneshtorgbank, VTB. The U.S. could kick them out of the dollar payment system. As I say, from now on, you're prohibited from transacting in dollars. We could get our European allies and kick them out of the international payment system, which is SWIFT, based in Belgium, so that they couldn't transact in euros. I mean, that's extremely, it's an extremely damaging sanction. By the way, it's exactly what the United States did to Iran. The U.S. has been in a financial war with Iran since 2012, and we kicked Iran out of the payment system. They got to the point where they could ship oil, but they couldn't get paid for it. They're doing barter deals, they're doing gold deals, they're getting paid in local currencies, they're using China and Russia as front men to transact in dollars without disclosing the real party of interest. So it's been very, very disruptive to the Iranian economy. Well, we could do that to Russia, but we won't. And the reason is that Russia will retaliate. What could they do? Well, they could do a lot of things. They could dump their U.S. Treasury obligations. That would cause U.S. interest rates to go up, probably sink our stock market, damage our housing market. They could refuse to pay dollar debts. They could freeze assets of U.S. companies in Russia. A lot of people don't know the U.S. has a big satellite program. Our satellites are built in the United States, mostly by Boeing. They're launched in Central Asia under Russian auspices. So that's an example of why we can't do this. I call this the mutual assured financial destruction. That's an echo of the 1960s and 70s Cold War, when the nuclear warfighting doctrine was called mutual assured destruction, or MAD, or the MAD doctrine. And both the United States and Russia, the Soviet Union at the time, basically Russia, had enough missiles to destroy the other completely. So there was always a temptation to shoot first, because if you could shoot your missiles and wipe out the other guy, you sort of win. That's an unstable system. So what the two countries did is they acquired more and more missiles. This was the arms race. And the idea was if the other side shot their missiles at you, you'd suffer enormous damage, but you'd have enough missiles left to shoot back and wipe out the other guy. And we analogize this to two scorpions in a bottle. So one scorpion stings the other, it's going to die, but just before it dies, it has enough strength left to sting back, and they both die. That may actually maintain the peace during the Cold War. It sounds a little crazy, but it worked. At least it was more stable than the other system I described with the second strike capability. Well, now come forward 40 years. We're in the same arena financially. The U.S. will not escalate against Russia because of the retaliation Russia is capable of inflicting. And at the ultimate, the Russian hackers could close down the New York Stock Exchange. And I mentioned this the other day, and someone said, well, the U.S. hackers could close down the Moscow Stock Exchange. And I said, of course they could. Our hackers are as good as theirs. But if they shut down the New York Stock Exchange and we shut down the Moscow Stock Exchange, who wins? Obviously the Russians win, because the New York Stock Exchange is far more important. The U.S. has far more to lose. But that's the kind of world we're living in. So you're going to see this financial threat, retaliation, this mutual assured financial destruction. Another very important trend comes from Saudi Arabia. For 45 years, Saudi Arabia has been one of the major supports under the dollar, under the so-called petrodollar deal that was worked out by Henry Kissinger in the mid-1970s. And it basically said that Saudi Arabia, and by extension OPEC, agreed to price oil in dollars. They didn't have to do that. I mean, you could price it in other currencies, you could price it in gold, you could do a lot of things, but they agreed to price it in dollars. Well, everyone in the world needs oil, so that means you need dollars, because if you want to buy oil, you need dollars to pay for it. So this created a demand for dollars over and above normal commercial transactions, and was one of the part of the glue that kept the United States as the leading reserve currency all these decades. Well, now the United States has stabbed Saudi Arabia in the back by cozying up to Iran. The president did this in December when he announced his talks with the Iranians around their effort to gain nuclear weapons. Those talks really aren't going to go anywhere. I mean, the Iranians have been playing this game, buying time for 5 years. That will continue to go on. As of now, the Iranians still have their nuclear reactors, so they're creating plutonium, which is only good for one thing, building nuclear weapons. They have their centrifuges, they're continuing to enrich uranium. Nothing really has changed, and the U.S. in effect has anointed Iran as the regional hegemonic power in the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf, and has green-lighted their nuclear ambitions. Well, the whole petrodollar deal, I described how Saudi Arabia would support the dollar, but the quid pro quo is the United States would support the House of Saud. In other words, we guaranteed their national security and they supported the dollar. Now that we've pulled the rug out from under their national security guarantee by empowering Iran, why should they support the dollar? So again, look around the world, see China scramble for gold, Russia on the brink of financial warfare with the United States, Saudi Arabia backing away from the dollar. And you have a very unstable state of affairs. These things are not going to play out overnight. They're all trends, but they're trends that bear watching. I'll leave it at that. But this is part of the analysis as to the potential collapse of the international monetary system. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and spend a few minutes on what we call a little bit of a science lecture, a bit of a digression, but something called a paradigm shift. I hate to use cliches. A lot of people throw the word paradigm around loosely, don't really understand what it means, and anytime there's a little change in something, they call it a paradigm shift. Paradigm shift is much more powerful, much more profound. Your paradigm is your frame of understanding everything, whether it's a financial system or climate or cosmology or any branch of science or any major phenomena you're trying to understand. The paradigm is kind of how you think about it. Paradigm shifts happen infrequently. They happen with great difficulty. This was all laid out by Thomas Kuhn in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions from the early 1960s. Now, I want to suggest that there's a paradigm shift going on in economics, but to do that, I want to illustrate one of the most famous paradigm shifts in history. So from the 1st century AD to the 16th century AD, a period of 1,500 years, there was a cosmological view of the universe put forward by the cosmologist, astronomer Claudius Ptolemy. And it was very simple. He said that the Earth was the center of the universe, center of the solar system. And the sun and the moon and the planets and the stars all revolved around the Earth in concentric circles. And this is very obvious because if you're on the Earth and you wake up, you see the sun comes up over there and it goes down over there and it comes back around over there and they're all round. And it was pretty obvious that the sun was revolving around the Earth. Well, this was the paradigm, as I say, for 1,500 years. There's only one problem, which is that scientists began to notice that sometimes the planets weren't exactly where they were supposed to be. There were these big counterclockwise circular orbits, and they were supposed to follow that orbit, but sometimes they would be off a little bit. So I've illustrated here, here's this yellow line. It's supposed to be the path of Saturn, but they would look and see that Saturn's over here instead of over here. So they said, well, how to explain that? Well, they knew that the Earth was the center of the universe, that's the point. So they said, well, there must be little circles on the big circles, and they call these epicycles. And they actually did the mathematics behind them, and you can see them illustrated here. So here's Mars. Here's the major cycle of Mars, but there's a little epicycle here. You can see the little epicycles on the circles, a little bit of a loop-to-loop. They spent centuries doing this math. And they weren't dumb. These were the smartest people. There were just as many geniuses in the 12th century as there are in the 21st century. But this view prevailed for 1,500 years until Copernicus came along and a few of his successors, Kepler and Tycho Brahe, and they said, well, wait a second. What if the Earth isn't the center of the universe? What if the sun, at least, is the center of the solar system? and the Earth and the other planets revolve around the sun, and the orbits are not circular, they're elliptical, how does that work? And they found out it worked perfectly. That's actually the way things are, and then they began to model that, and that's been the paradigm ever since. So this shift from the geocentric view, where the Earth is the center, to the heliocentric view, where the sun is the center of the solar system, that's what we mean by a paradigm shift.